Welcome everyone to today's event presented by URI's Art and Art History Department on Unseeing Empire, Photography, Representation, South Asian America with Professor Bakirathi Mani.
Nobody is going to ever replace the capacity of a human. And this is why thinking is our #1 obsession.
A College of Arts and Sciences education gives you the confidence to bring together all the strands that you value and apply them in ways that are fulfilling for you as an individual, but also resonate out.
You have to really look at schools as a place to grow as yourself. And I think that URI does a great job of that.
There's a sense of pride in the work that you put out there. Students are just excited. Whatever field they're in, they want to be the best at it. And I think that's kind of infectious.
The thing that sets URI apart is that we as a faculty and as an institution ask our students not just what you can do, but who can you be?
I am pleased to welcome and introduce Bakirathi Mani, who is a professor in the Department of English Literature and coordinator of the Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Swarthmore College. Professor Mani is a scholar of Asian American studies, post-colonial theory, and feminist and queer of color studies. She works across visual, ethnographic, historical, and literary archives of South Asians in diaspora. Professor Mani is also a curator of South Asian diasporic visual cultures. She regularly collaborates with artists, academics, and activists on public events nationwide. Professor Mani was born in Bombay, now Mumbai, raised in Tokyo, and educated in Japan, the United States, and India. She earned her PhD in modern thought and literature from Stanford University. Her work on South Asian diasporic cultures has been published in American Quarterly, Social Text, the Journal of Asian American Studies, Diaspora Positions in Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures, and the Americas, among others. Professor Mani has published 2 books. The first, Aspiring to Home, South Asians in America, was published by Stanford University Press in 2012. And her second and most recent book, Unseeing Empire, Photography, Representation, South Asian America, was published last year by Duke University Press, and it is the topic of her talk today. In Unseeing Empire, Mani considers how empire continues to haunt contemporary visual representations of South Asians in America, shaping both the form of fine art photography as well as how racialized diasporic viewers claim and identify with these images. Weaving ethnographic work at museums and galleries across North America and in South Asia, together with her own experience as a curator, Mani examines the limits of visibility and visuality for Asian American representation. We are especially proud that her talk today will include one of URI's own, Annu Palakunnathu Matthew, who is a professor of art specializing in photography. Professor Mani will focus on Annu's highly acclaimed photographic series, An Indian from India. With that, I'm excited to turn the floor, the virtual floor, over to Professor Bakirathi Mani as she discusses Unseeing Empire, Photography, Representation, South Asian America. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure for me to be here, and I will share my screen. Here we go. Thank you so much, and I will get going. I want to thank Kathy Quick for her really warm and lovely invitation to speak at the University of Rhode Island. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with the artist and Professor Annu Palakunnathu Matthew and all of you at her home institution. And I want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences, the URI Center for the Humanities, and the Department of Art and Art History. I look forward to being in conversation with all of you today. I'm delighted to discuss my new book, Unseeing Empire, Photography, Representation, South Asian America. My book focuses on fine art photography of South Asians in the United States in order to think through what it means for immigrants to be represented. For immigrants of color, including myself, we often understand our own desire for representation to emerge out of our invisibility in U.S. public culture, an absence that we think can be rectified with better or more visual representations of ourselves. But what if representation itself is a problem, particularly in photography, when the history of photography is a history of the documentation and surveillance of people of color, including immigrants and indigenous peoples? Some of the questions that I ask in this book include, what does it mean for racialized immigrants to see visual images of themselves? How do we establish relations of identity with the photographic object? And why do we feel so drawn to images that we think represent us? What do we do with visual artworks that repels us or alienates us? Oh, I apologize. I just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen. And I will get back to that. Great. So I think through these questions in relation to photograph-based art by a number of artists, including Annu Palakunnathu Matthew, Gauri Gill, and Seher Shah, each of whom creates artwork that reproduces or disseminates photographic images from a variety of personal and national archives that include Imperial British archives, as well as settler colonial US archives. By weaving together archival research and close readings of the artworks, as well as ethnographic fieldwork in museums and galleries across North America and in India, I argue that contemporary representations of South Asian immigrants are haunted by histories of empire, including empires not of our own time. The colonial archive, I suggest, is critical to how we understand the expansive geography of empire, for the archive shapes how and where, as racialized subjects, we look for images of our own past, as well as the ways in which we create images of ourselves for the future. And what I'll do today is share a chapter from Unseen Empire that focuses on an extraordinary set of diptychs that Annu has created called An Indian from India. I'll talk about how An Indian from India works as a contemporary representation of South Asian immigration by binding together histories of ethnographic photography from the late 19th through the early 21st century. I'll discuss how South Asian immigrant viewers claim An Indian from India as a representation of our own migrations, but I'll also discuss how the display of this work at a major natural history museum made me think about what histories of empire are made visible in the museum and what histories are obscured or ignored. Across the book, I'm interested in why South Asian immigrants look to photography as an archival record, how photography can refuse to show us the representations that we're looking for, and in what ways photography reshapes our sense of the time and space of immigration. And a quick note, you'll see that I use the term South Asian across my talk. In my first book, Aspiring to Home, I've demonstrated how second-generation immigrants from the subcontinent in the United States and in Canada create new forms of identity and community that cut across region, language, and religion. I argue in this book that young immigrants from the subcontinent identify as South Asians rather than as Indian or as Pakistani, Malayali or Punjabi, Hindu or Sikh. I'll continue to use South Asian as a collective term of identity in this project as well. In An Indian from India, the question of representation comes to the surface of the photographic print. In this series of diptychs, produced between 1999 and 2007, Matthew takes images from Edward Curtis's 20-volume set, The North American Indian, among other contemporaneous photographic collections of indigenous peoples in the Americas, recreating the scene of Curtis's photograph with herself as the subject. As many of you know, between 1907 and 1930, Curtis traveled across North America from the Mexican border to Alaska, documenting over 80 tribes, photographing an indigenous population that he was convinced was on the verge of quote-unquote vanishing from history. Faithfully adhering to the sepia tone printing, lighting, and setting that characterizes Curtis's studio photography, Matthew's digital images reproduce the ethnographic form and the modes of display that characterize the North American Indian. Looking across the diptychs from left to right and back again, we see the precise alignment between the archival image and Matthew's duplication, how the torn and ripped edges that mark the archival image are reproduced in her photographs, and the ways in which she replicates the stances held by native portrait subjects in her own body. And you'll see here that alongside Curtis's work, Matthew also deploys photographic portraits from J.N. Choate, B.S. Gifford, and Case and Draper, all of whom were white settler photographers whose studio practices were roughly contemporaneous with Curtis. Displayed as framed prints and as orotones, the arresting difference that marks each diptych slowly comes into view. We notice how Matthew's captions rewrite Curtis's descriptions of his subjects, how she incorporates subcontinental fabrics and jewelry in her clothing, and the ways that she gently cradles a plastic Barbie doll in one image rather than a human baby. And here's that image. As Matthew duplicates early 20th century portraits of native peoples as a means to enact her own self-representation, an Indian from India makes visible the relations of power between the ethnographic subject and the aesthetic object, between acts of picture-taking and picture-making, and between native people and South Asian immigrants, who are both named Indians in this diptych. Matthew notes in her artist statement that, and I quote here, "In this portfolio, I play on these stereotypes using photographs of Native Americans from the 19th century. I pair these with contemporary images of myself in clothes, poses, and environments that mimic these older images. I am challenging the viewer's assumption of then and now, us and them, exotic and local." By reframing Curtis's photographic images in relation to her own visible presence in the United States, an Indian from India initially appears to displace indigenous subjects in the Americas to foreground instead the experience of immigrants from South Asia. I want to expand our understanding of these diptychs by considering another way of seeing, a way of stepping outside the framework of these diptychs to complicate the visual narratives at stake and to consider how multiple histories of colonialism and empire shape what we see. Curtis's photographs were seen for most of the 20th century as an authentic representation of indigenous peoples. However, more recently, scholars and curators have shown how Curtis's portraits were staged to enact a seemingly timeless depiction of Indianness. Curtis and his peers often use the same people to pose in photographs meant to depict different native nations. He borrowed confiscated regalia from museums and government archives to elaborately stage tableaus of battles and dances. We know from art historians that Curtis eliminated modern objects such as blue jeans and clocks from his photographic negatives, and that he used a large aperture to lend a soft, romantic focus to several images. That is, Curtis's photographs produced precisely those natives whom he wanted to see. In this sense, the archival image betrays our desire for authentic representation. At work in this settler colonial archive, Matthew creates diptychs that magnify her own racial subjugation as an immigrant through performative and citational practices that reinscribe technologies of documentation and surveillance practiced by Curtis and his peers. In turn, the artwork that she produces intensifies the viewer's relation of identification with and estrangement from the image. We think that we see, on the right side of the diptych, an Indian. But what we realize as we view Matthew's self-portraits in relation to the reproduced archival images on the left is the fact that these original photographs of native subjects are also a performance. Looking at the diptychs from left to right and back again, what we realize is that photography cannot capture the truth of the Indian, whether indigenous or immigrant. In Matthew's diptych Smiles, which is the image you can see here, the left side is an unpublished photograph from Curtis's archives titled A Navajo Smile, and that's taken in 1904. On the right side of the diptych is Matthew, who occupies the same frontal position as the subject of Curtis's print. The archival image features an unnamed woman draped in a blanket, her body and her face turned towards the camera. Sunlight streams in from the left side of the picture frame, emphasizing the textures of the blanket, her skirt, and her thickly braided hair. On the right, we see Matthew's sari, which tonally reflects the adjacent blanket. She mimics a pose of the female subject, but I see her smile as a little bit more quizzical. The female subject of a Navajo smile, in fact, appears in two images later compiled in Curtis's A North American Indian. The first is an image called Navajo Woman, and the second is an image called The Blanket Maker, both of which were also taken in 1904. In Navajo Woman, the subject directly faces the viewer. With one eye slightly squinted, the left side profile of her face is cast in shadow. She wears a woven blanket, multiple necklaces, as well as an ornate belt. And we know from archival sources that her jewelry also belongs to Curtis. In The Blanket Maker, the same subject covered in another blanket holds a neatly bundled skein of yarn. It's important to note that in all three images, the subject of photograph remains unnamed. Like the image later used in Smiles, the archival photograph's beauty, that is, its aesthetic value, corresponds directly to its ethnographic value. We perceive the authenticity of this image in the absence of a studio backdrop and what appears to be the female subject's smile. And yet, it's precisely through naturalizing this style of ethnographic photography that Curtis continued to create the very indigenous subjects that he wanted to see. So, instead of an authentic ethnographic subject, what I see in An Indian from India is a performance of identity on both sides of the diptych. Once we recognize that these ethnographic photographs are a performance, we can also see how the subjects of the print exceed the national, regional, or linguistic appellations such as Navajo or Malayali that are appended to them. I'll turn to another image. In Bells, Matthew pairs an archival image taken by the photographer Frank LaRoche, a contemporary of Edward Curtis, with another self-portrait. In both photographs, the portrait subject sits upright, in a three-quarter pose directly facing the camera. LaRoche's luminously lit studio portrait features an unnamed female subject. Her ears, neck, and wrists are adorned with beaded and metal jewelry. Her waist is cinched with a woven belt. These material objects occupy an intimate relation to the body of the sitter. The silver jewelry touches her skin, her shoulders are covered by a textured blanket, and her hair is ornamentally displayed in two perfectly symmetrical braids. What makes this woman a belle from Yakima is precisely the profusion of jewelry and clothing that she wears, because there's nothing outside of the studio portrait to suggest the location of this photographic subject in the sovereign indigenous land of the Yakama Nation, bordered by Washington State. Likewise, in her self-portrait, Matthew also wears elaborate earrings and multiple necklaces and ties a sash around her torso. Restraining her curly hair into two braids, Matthew looks discomfited by her identification as a belle. The Deccan Plateau of the title refers to a vast stretch of central and southern India, including Matthew's hometown, Bangalore. But just as we cannot see the Yakama Nation in LaRoche's photograph, the Deccan Plateau cannot encompass Matthew's diasporic locations in England or in the United States. Matthew's use of a wide range of textiles and accessories from various regions of India in this image also reflects back on the abundant use of accessories to identify the unnamed native subject as Yakima. As this diptych shows us, it's through forms of bodily adornment that both photographic subjects are racialized as Indian and gendered female. The objects that Matthew uses to identify herself as an Indian, indeed the very idea that what it means to be an Indian can be represented through material objects, are in fact central to the visual archive of another empire at another time. This is a history of 19th century ethnographic photography on the Indian subcontinent, images of indigenous subjects created by British colonial photographers. It's this genealogy of photographing the Indian that haunts my viewing of Matthew's diptychs. It's a mimetic connection between two imperial projects, U.S. settler colonialism on native lands and British colonialism in South Asia, that flashes up at the interstices of An Indian from India. So I want to conjure here another colonial archive, one that's not explicitly replicated in Matthew's diptychs, but that surfaces beneath her photographic reproductions as a remembered set of images or as a familiar feeling that shapes my consumption of her art. The People of India is an 8-volume collection commissioned as a private memento for the first British Viceroy of India between 1868 and 1875. The People of India compiled images of, quote, the more remarkable tribes to be found in India, in photographs that, quote, should be large enough to exhibit the chief physical peculiarities and the distinctive costume of each race, end quote. Across 480 images, the People of India created an encyclopedic rendition of caste, regional, religious, and linguistic groups on the subcontinent. Preceding the North American Indian by nearly 40 years, the photographs collected in the People of India are distinct in one key respect from the images later produced by Curtis. This imperial archive is not intent on capturing what Curtis described as a so-called vanishing Indian, but rather in documenting a colonized subject population that proliferates beyond the camera's eye. There are too many Indians to photograph, hence a need for a taxonomic compilation. But what aligns the People of India with the North American Indian is the fact that both collections secured the camera's claims to scientific truth, as well as the capacity of the photograph to produce and archive racial difference. As a whole, the People of India documents the colonial subjugation of South Asia and South Asians. But as I see it, each of the volumes that constitute the People of India remains critical to how we see the people whom we call Indians, not only during the colonial era, but also in our post-colonial times. It's the regime of the colonial photograph, its capacity to conjure a place and a time, a people and a culture that continues to shape how we understand the social and political relation between so-called tribal and modern citizens in India today, as well as between indigenous and immigrant subjects in the United States. For South Asians in diaspora like Matthew and myself who encountered these volumes now, in what ways can such images shape our contemporary representations of ourselves? There's no historical documentation that confirms whether Curtis was influenced by the People of India, although these volumes traveled as far as Chicago, Melbourne, New York, and Berlin. However, in recalling this other set of images, I want to acknowledge how Curtis's obsessive need to photograph the Indian echoes throughout my viewing of the People of India, and likewise how colonial technologies of surveillance and documentation that shape the People of India ripple through the North American Indian. In both, the imperial camera becomes a mode of ordering the world, the means through which historical knowledge is produced and disseminated and consumed. It's the order that the camera imposes on its subjects that comes to appear as ethnographic fact and as aesthetic beauty. It's these beautiful images that become the photographic matter of the archive. And it's within these imperial archives that South Asian immigrant viewers like myself look for traces of self-representation. I'll turn finally to a reading of an Indian from India that situates these diptychs within the context of museum exhibitions. In October 2015, I went to see a solo show of Matthew's work at the Royal Ontario Museum, the ROM, in Toronto. Titled Generations, the exhibition, curated by the art historian Dipali Diwan, showcased the importance of immigrant self-representation across multiple generations. It also demonstrated how, in Matthew's hands, a single photographic print can transmute into a fictional narrative, a historical document, and an aesthetic object. As Canada's largest museum of natural history and world cultures, the ROM was an extraordinary site to display Matthew's art, and you can see the very impressive facade of the museum in the image at the bottom. Generations was displayed in a gallery steps away from the museum's collection of contemporary South Asian art, the South Asian Gallery, which is the image on the upper left. The South Asian Gallery, in turn, was 3 levels above the museum's main atrium, which is presided over by a life-size dinosaur skeleton, and that's the image on the upper right. At first glance, Generation appears to be wedged between 2 contradictory forms of display. On the one hand, an exhibition of evolutionary biology, and on the other hand, a prominent South Asian art collection. But there's also a third form of exhibition at the ROM, one that's central to my reading of Matthew's work, and that's the Daphne Cockwell Gallery of Canada First Peoples. The Cockwell Gallery presents a collection of material objects crafted and curated by First Nations Indigenous peoples, including wooden sleighs, birch bark canoes, sealskin coats, blankets, and spears. And it displays all of these objects in a gallery that has paintings by settler colonial artists, as you can see on the right of this image. At the center of the gallery space are life-size dioramas that feature the museum's wax sculptures of First Nations peoples, refashioned with jeans, iPods, and camera tripods. And so this is an attempt to restore those modern objects that were excised from Curtis's photographic negatives. The ROM's representation of Indigenous peoples as objects under ongoing conditions of settler colonial rule becomes integral, in my view, to seeing generations, an exhibition that encourages immigrant self-representation. An Indian from India was displayed 3 floors above the Daphne Cockwell Gallery. For the first time, Matthew's diptychs were paired alongside original prints from Curtis's The North American Indian, a series that's also part of the ROM's permanent collection. At Generations, a glass case contained 2 images from the North American Indian. The first is Cheyenne Girl, taken in 1905, that's the image on the right here, and 2 Moons Cheyenne, that's the image on the left, and that's taken in 1910. Loosened from the archive, the large plate format emphasizes Curtis's extreme close-up of the unnamed young woman and the exaggerated attention that Curtis pays to 2 Moons' headdress as a mark of his nobility. This image of 2 Moons Cheyenne is displayed twice more in the exhibition within multiple copies of Matthew's diptych on display. As I walked through the gallery space, I was overwhelmed by the experience of seeing 2 Moons Cheyenne on its own and as a reproduction in Matthew's diptych Nobles, and that you can see here. I had entered the ROM expecting to see my own identity as a South Asian immigrant mirrored in Matthew's installations, within a major exhibition that was itself a celebration of South Asian American representation. But what I experienced instead was a sense of disorientation, an inability to see the difference between the original print and its duplications, between Curtis's performance photography and Matthew's, between Matthew's self-representation and my claim to her image as a representation of myself. Despite my repeated efforts to walk across multiple galleries in order to tie together these disjointed forms of representation, what I came to experience was the fact that the settler colonial and imperial archives that shape how I see an Indian from India were shut out of the viewing frame. They remained firmly locked in other spaces of the museum, namely in the South Asian Gallery and in the Cockwell Gallery. What does it mean for immigrants to see ourselves in the photograph and to recall at the same time the memory of seeing ourselves in colonial and settler colonial ethnographic photography? How do we recognize ourselves as both the subjects of our own representation and as objects on view in imperial projects of representation? The fact that viewers like myself persist in seeing ourselves alongside the artist in this photographic series, as if we're also Indians, as if these archival images confirm our own authenticity, makes clear the legacy of images of empire. As I write throughout my book, empire comes to life not just in the photographic image, but also in the spaces of the museum, shaping our most intimate as well as our most public attempts at seeing ourselves. For South Asian diasporic viewers and artists, our insistent collective desire for representation is itself an effect of imperial archives, a haunted vision of seeing oneself. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Baki, and welcome to URI. You've done a number of talks together, and it's so wonderful to bring you to my institution. And I just want to acknowledge that the URI and where I am now is on the traditional land of the Niantic and Narragansett people. So as usual, your talks are always thought-provoking. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Actually, I would love to ask you to step in here because I've been so inspired by your work. And one thing that I think, I would love to hear more of, and I'm sure others would as well, is if you could share the process of making an Indian from India with us.
Sure. And I was thinking about that question this morning, and I realized that part of creating this project, An Indian from India, actually happened because of a question that a student at URI asked me. It was, I guess it must have been 1999. On Columbus Day, a student said, why are the Native Americans making such a fuss about Columbus Day? And then I regretted never saying anything. I was like kicking myself because that was a perfect opportunity. And that plus the fact that I've had the experience of always having to clarify that I'm an Indian from India because of my strange accent was kind of the starting point of making this work. And, a book that I also give credit for is Different Mirrors by Ronald Takaki, where he talks about the history of the United States through different lenses of ethnicity. And that really influenced my work and made me look at a lot of images of Native Americans. And then one you didn't show today is of a mother and a child. And the curve of that armchair is similar to a chair that I have. And that's how I got the idea of putting these diptychs together. And I started with film photography, so it was always difficult to know if I got the expression or the stance right. But once digital came along, it became a lot easier. And they were all taken in my living room using natural light, and then a lot of post-production.
Yeah, I remember that image that you're referring to, which is the one that I think is a woman and a child on the one side. And is that the one with you and your stepdaughter on the other? Where she's
That's right, yeah.
It's a beautiful image, yeah. I think one of the things that has really drawn me to An Indian from India are the kinds of personal relationships that we forge with these kinds of archival images. And in my book, I talk a little bit about the British Imperial Colonial Archive that I see as haunting Curtis's own photography. I wondered if you can speak a little bit of your experience with that archive, the Archive of the People of India.
I was a little, I guess, stunned when I first saw it because it's really disturbing, and it also made me realize in a way, photography is also a weapon of power.
Yes.
And so it was really disturbing. And it's one of the reasons why I turned the camera on myself rather than photographing other Indians to be in those diptychs. It's because I wanted to be the one who has control over my own representation.
Yeah.
But yes, I just found them very disturbing, but also I think more recently found out they were created after the mutiny in India.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and to me that actually was new news. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, so one of the really fascinating things about the Archive of the People of India was that, as I mentioned, it was commissioned by Governor General Lord Canning and his wife, who were these. Canning was the first British Viceroy of India, so he was a person who was put into place after the 1857 Sepoy Mutiny, what's also known as the First War of Indian Independence. And that's the moment when British rule in India transitioned from rule by the British East India Company to Crown rule, that is like direct rule by the British monarchy.
Correct, yeah.
And one of the things that I found so fascinating in my research is learning that Canning and his wife wanted a collection of photographs just as a personal memento, as a kind of souvenir of their time in India. And so, these photographs, and of course, these photographs were taken some 40, 50 years earlier to Curtis's own images. You were just speaking about how difficult it was to compose photographs on film and the easy transition to digital. So I'm just thinking about how in the 1860s, how much time it took to create these photographic images, but they were initially meant as just a kind of personal souvenir for the governor. And what happened, of course, is that it became a much larger government project where memos were sent to British administrative units all across India, where both amateurs as well as British military officers with cameras And commercial photographers, British commercial photographers, were invited to participate in this project of taking portraits of native peoples, right? Because the British, of course, called the Indians in India natives as well. And so one of the things that has been so compelling to me in the course of doing research on your work is encountering this other archive and thinking about, okay, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to create an image and fix this as a representation of a particular community, right? You were just saying how the camera is a kind of tool of power, but every person who's photographed in the people of India didn't actually have control over the means of their own representation.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And they were also very often, I mean, as you can see across those 8 volumes, and each of the volumes is available for free on Google if anybody wants to check it out. All the images are online now, but you can see how so many of the images are deliberately misrecognizing or mistyping people from one community to the other. And so there's a lot of like category confusion in a set of photographs that's meant to correctly codify who is what.
And I just want to mention that your book is available at URI, both online and physical form, if anyone wants to read more about it. So, but I had a few questions for you. One is, you talk about the haunting and the colonial archive haunting your views, but I was also wondering if, as being from the diaspora, we also have a sense of loss, and you and I both have a similar experience of having lived in more than 2 countries, and there's a certain haunting in terms of a certain amount of loss.
Yes.
And there's a Welsh word, I don't know if you've heard of it, called Herit, which means it goes beyond nostalgia, but it's almost this emptiness. And that word really resonates with me, and I was wondering if you had heard of that word, or if you agree or disagree with that point of view.
Yeah, no, I haven't actually heard of the word, and I'm so grateful that you've brought it up to me. So it means, it doesn't mean nostalgia. Can you tell me the definition again? It means beyond.
I actually printed it out because I knew I wouldn't. It's a Welsh word that's difficult to describe in English because there's no single English word that expresses all that it does. Some words that explain it are homesickness, yearning, and longing. But it can also include grief or sadness for what you have lost, losses which make your home not the same as the one you remember.
Oh, I think that's so beautifully put. Losses that make your home not the same as the one that you remember. In the cluster of definitions you were just reading out to us, you were also highlighting, Annu, the ways in which our yearning or desire for a home is so closely linked with feelings of grief. So what is it that we're mourning when we think about our homes, right? And as you say, you and I have had very different diasporic trajectories, but in some ways they're quite similar, right? My parents are Indian. I was born in India. We moved to Japan when I was 1. My family lived there for 35 years. I came from Japan to the United States for college. I went to India for graduate school. I came back to the US for graduate school again, and, of course, have stayed here. And in your case, you were born in England, moved to India just sort of at the turn of adolescence, and then came to the United States as an adult for your own education and career. And so there are different trajectories of diaspora, but what I find so fascinating, and I think maybe what has prompted me to kind of take up this idea of haunting in the book, is what are the kinds of losses that we incur when we move from one place to the other? And I mean, not only like the loss of a fixed geographic idea of home or homeland, right? I also mean like the kinds of losses of a sense of continuous history, or a loss of a sense of continuous community, and having to think about yourself always in relation to the dominant society's perception of you. So one example, and this is actually a concept that I kind of work with throughout the book, is I'm so interested in the ways in which South Asian Americans are Oh, so first, I'm so interested in South Asian Americans because until I came to the United States, I didn't realize that you could belong to the place that you've immigrated to, right? So,
Okay.
when I grew up in Japan, there was no question that I was Indian because I could not be Japanese. So though I moved there when I was 1, my brother was born there, we were always raised with this very strong sense, both from my parents, but also from the society around us, that we were Indian and not Japanese. Then I came to the United States as an undergraduate, and I realized that all the young South Asian Americans that I was meeting considered the United States their home. And when you ask them where they were from, they wouldn't say India or Pakistan. They would say New York City or, New Jersey or something like that. So that was absolutely fascinating to me. What does it mean to claim a place as your home? And of course, over the years, I've kind of toyed with that question. And to get back to my own book, I think that one thing that has been so compelling to me is, okay, well, it's one thing to claim that you are from here, but does this country really accept you, right, as who you are, right? Your own project in Indian from India is an attempt to define your place here, right? And I think as friends, we're constantly invested in the process of proving our sense of belonging here.
Absolutely. So I have time for one more question before my colleague Kathy Quick is going to join us. You mentioned that Curtis's work some of his volumes were also sent to Berlin.
Yes.
Is that one of the reasons why the Germans have such a fascination with the Native Americans culture?
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's one that I hadn't thought about the connection with before. It's true that the people of India did travel to Berlin. I am not sure where it was archived there or whether it was publicly accessible. I do know that the German fascination with indigenous peoples kind of emerges out of their own history of empire in Africa in particular, right? And so I think the notion of who is primitive and who is modern really emerges out of that practice of German colonialism overseas, and possibly their colonial Germans' obsession with indigenous peoples in the Americas was a kind of offshoot of that. Yeah, but I think and you've said this in your own artist statements as well, right? That your work in An Indian from India is to always think about the relation between us and them, self and other, exotic and local, right?
Yeah.
I think that's exactly how colonial Germans and Americans in the early 20th century, late 19th century thought about these photographs of indigenous peoples. But of course, we also know they've done tremendous violence, right? To narratives of indigeneity and sovereignty in the Americas.
Well, I think that's a perfect time to welcome my colleague, Kathy Quick, to join us.
Thank you, guys. We could just listen all day. You guys are great. But as you keep talking, we keep getting more questions. So if anybody has a question, type it in. Point of moderator privilege, I'm going to start. So Professor Mani, you are very open about the personal connection you have with these images. And perhaps we should all be more conscious of the ways in which we look for ourselves in photographic images. So my question is, why is seeing yourself, to use your term, so crucial in this project?
Oh, thank you for that question, which really opens up, I think, the heart of this book. So one of the ambitions that I have for this book is that it is a project that enables racialized minorities in the United States. I focus particularly on South Asians in the United States, but I'm using the term racialized minorities to encompass Asian Americans more broadly, as well as people of color who live in the United States. I think all of us have a real strong desire to see ourselves reflected in public culture. And visual culture becomes one domain where we can find these images of ourselves, maybe much more so now than 20 or 30 years ago when I was an undergraduate student. So I'm interested in the ways in which, as racialized minorities, we desire to see ourselves represented in public culture. But then when we do see ourselves represented, there's often an element of the image that we feel fails us or doesn't satisfy us, right? So we think that, as minorities, that our quest or desire for representation can be fulfilled if we can just see more or better images of ourselves. But what if there's something odd about the project of representation itself? One thing that I argue in this book is, what if the project of representation itself is an imperial project? Then we're never going to feel satisfied in the images that we see, because they'll always constantly refer back to these colonial archives. I've mentioned 2 specific colonial archives in my work today, but there's a multiplicity, I think, of imperial archives that shape these paradigms of racial representation in the United States.
Excellent. So that goes nicely to the next question we have from one of our undergraduates, Aileen Hunt. And so it's kind of flipping that idea on its head a bit. So
I'm an art history major, and I had the following question for you. Given the imperialist lens these portraits of Indigenous people were viewed through, what do you think a level playing field would have changed about the pictures? What effect do you think these pictures would have had if Indigenous people had had influence over their own portrayal? I look forward to reading your book in the future.
Thank you so much. What a great question from Eileen, who's asking about a level playing field. I think that one of the aspects of the book that I wasn't able to talk about at length today, but that I do write about, is that the curation of, for example, Annu's work is so central to understanding how we can level out the playing field between these kinds of portraits. So, for example, I have seen Annu's work in a variety of different contexts. I've seen it in private commercial art galleries, at small nonprofit galleries, and in major natural history museums, not only the Royal Ontario Museum, but also the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. And so I think in these natural history kinds of contexts, it's important to recognize that the museum itself is a kind of imperial space, right? Natural history museums are premised on the display of Indigenous peoples and of racialized peoples as objects. Natural history museums emerge out of this colonial history of the 19th century, and they were constructed to display people who were non-white, non-European, non-American as objects. So what then does it mean to display the work of an artist of color in a museum like this, especially when that artwork in turn involves the Indigenous portraits by settler artists like Edward Curtis? So I think that the display of the work at natural history museums generates a particular kind of narrative. But the same artwork displayed in another kind of gallery space, perhaps in conversation with other artists of color, other artists who have also taken self-portraits or family portraits. And I think the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston is another place where I've seen Annu's artwork. When I see her work there, it generates a totally different kind of narrative. And maybe that's what Eileen was referring to, a more level playing field.
Excellent. Yeah. So Annu, this is another good segue from that point. Has your work been exhibited in India? And if so, what venues, what kind of reactions, or has there been a response to your work that surprised you over the years?
The work has been shown in India. In India, we don't have as many museums or galleries as here, but we used to have one photography gallery, a commercial gallery that did show the work. And the reaction, I mean, the viewers really loved the humor of it and the reclaiming of the term Indian, because frankly, the term came up because Christopher Columbus got lost looking for India, but found North America instead. And so I think rather than being called East Indian, reclaiming that title seemed to be empowering for a number of the viewers of the work. Frankly, I've sold more of this work in India at American prices than I have in the US. So I think that shows some of the popularity of the work. This work wasn't controversial in India, but another more feminist body of work called Bollywood Satirized was. And it was actually controversial when I had a show at the University of Rhode Island.
Wow, thank you. One of our students has a question for you as well.
Okay.
My name is Jenna Leone, and I'm a senior at URI, majoring in studio art. I've actually taken photo 1 and photo 2 with Professor Matthew, so this was super interesting for me to see some of her work. I wanted to ask her a question. What have you learned about yourself as an immigrant from India in the process of making this photo series? Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Jenna's one of my students right now, so that's really nice. What have I learned about myself? I think I've learned, oh, that's a difficult question. I think I've learned the importance of self-representation. Recently in our class, we, watched a video about photoshopping women and how they're portrayed in magazines versus reality. The same thing goes for race, where, most magazines until very recently, the norm was only seeing Western image or white imagery. And I think speaking out and demanding more representation is something that I realized from that project. And thank you for that question.
Thanks, Annu. Baki, I was wondering, you said, well, my question is, were there examples of composite photography in the Indian archive in India? I was just noticing, you mentioned something about they created a type, but I was wondering if anyone actually did composites.
Kathy, can you explain to me what you mean by a composite?
Oh, okay. So taking more than one negative and sandwiching them together, because a photographer that I'm interested in did that with people in the immigrants in the United States and people in the United States.
That's really interesting. In the People of India archive, I'm not aware of anyone who has made composite photography. But can I take this opportunity to quickly expand on my answer to Eileen's question? Because I'm really thinking about what it means to level the playing field. And I know I mentioned curation as a strategy, but I'm also thinking about the work of a number of contemporary indigenous artists who have worked with and in relation to Curtis's archives. And I'm thinking about, actually, a couple of them have done some really fascinating work with Curtis's original prints, not by reproducing them in diptychs as Annu has, but by creating more multi-layered installation works, not quite composites, but generating conversations between contemporary photographs and these archival images. And I was thinking, how cool would it be to have an Indian from India in conversation with these indigenous artists' work, so that we can have a conversation about exactly what Annu has been saying, the importance of self-representation and these different strategies that artists, both indigenous and immigrant, are using to represent themselves.
Yeah, that's excellent. I was also wondering to what degree, and this is kind of along those lines, the Indians in Curtis's work were complicit or maybe even proud to partake. Yeah. And if they were, should that change our reading of the images?
So I don't know if the native peoples in Curtis as a North American Indian were complicit in the project. I think that this archive, the North American Indian, has had a really troubling legacy in Indigenous community, and I don't want to speak for Indigenous people's experiences of encountering this archive, but I think we can say two things. The first is that for a number of Indigenous peoples, this is a really painful archive to look at, an archive in which their own, as I said earlier, their own desire to represent themselves is really stripped away from them, and where they are rendered nameless, without identification, often mistakenly characterized as being from one tribe or another. So that's one thing. At the same time, it's also true that there are descendants of those who have been photographed by Curtis who can look to these images today and see, their great-grandmother or great-grandfather photographed in this kind of extraordinary way that provides you with a family legacy, right? So the archive is doing two things at the same time. It's obliterating the uniqueness of Indigenous peoples who are posing for the portraits, but it's also gifting some people the ability to say, oh, that person is my family. And that enables you to then have a different relationship to the settler colonial archive.
Yeah, that gives us a lot to think about. We have another, you may have somewhat answered this, but another student question coming through.
Hi, my name is Sydney Venditti, and I'm a senior TMD student at URI. And my question is for Dr. Mani. In Chapter 2, you mentioned viewing Generations at the RUM in 2015 and having a rather disorienting experience. In regards to museum setup, what role do you believe that curators play in the representation of racialized subjects in art? Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney, for such an amazing question. I feel like she might be a future curator. And I just want to say that, Annu's exhibition Generations at the ROM was just this extraordinary moment that was curated by, a really eminent curator, Dr. Dipali Diwan, who's a Canadian art historian and who works at the ROM. And I think one thing that I really enjoyed about Generations was just the amount of care that was lavished on the images that were showcased. And this was a 20-year retrospective of Annu's work at the ROM. So it wasn't just an Indian from India. It was a huge array of her artwork, her video installations, and so on. So I think that the work of curators like Dr. Diwan are really central for immigrants to feel both included and seen in natural history museums like the ROM, right? I think that this kind of curatorial work is really central to expanding the museum's reach to its audience, including to racialized immigrant groups who might not otherwise visit the museum. And Annu and Dr. Diwan also did a joint, I think you also did this event at the museum where you photographed people who identified as immigrants and who wanted to have you take photographs of themselves and their family. So there's all kinds of ways that I think curators can work with artists to make the museum an inclusive space. But I think that they also do so at the same time in recognition of and working against the kinds of institutional histories of the museum, right? So the reason why you can have an exhibition as amazing as Generations is it's out of Dr. Diwan and Annu's work together, because downstairs at the same museum, you've got this, extraordinarily objectifying display of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous objects.
Can I add to that too, which is during my exhibition, Dipali used that as a starting point to encourage families to give their photo albums to the museum so that they could, especially from minority groups, they specified which minority groups, to expand the representation so that when a curator goes into that same archive, they will see more than the colonial representation.
That's excellent. I actually like the idea of a natural history museum. I think it just complicates the whole matter so much more. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how you feel about that as the artist, but so I know this is a hard question to ask anyone, but where is your research taking you now, Baki? And Annu, what are you working on now?
Well, I've actually been totally inspired by Annu's artwork, and something that I write in the introduction to this book is how this project started a very long time ago in 2005 when I saw another one of Annu's works at an exhibition in New York called Fatal Love, South Asian American Art Now, and that was at the Queens Museum. And I saw there Annu's installation Fabricated Memories, which is a extraordinarily moving artwork that she's created that uses portrait photographs of her family, but that creates this whole extremely elegiac narrative. And so that project has inspired me to turn next towards a collection of 100 albums that documents my family's experience as Indian immigrants in Japan between 1976 and 2010. And these albums are now stored in my grandparents' house in Kerala, India. They're getting very moldy there. I'm hoping to retrieve those albums, digitize them, and sort of meditate a little bit on what these personal family photographs mean to me and how they are also narrating a very unique story about South Asians in diaspora.
Wow, you are truly looking for yourself.
But I hope that people can learn from that project too.
Look forward to it. Annu, how about you?
Well, I'm going to be spending 6 weeks in Italy this summer on a residency, putting together what I collected during my sabbatical last year, which is on the Indians, 2.5 million Indians who fought in World War II, but are not that history is not known in India, let alone globally. And then I'm actually having a solo show on our own turf at the Newport Art Museum, which will include that work. And it will include the Indian from India.
Well, that's excellent. So this has been, I mean, we probably go on for another hour or two, but I want to thank, first off, Professor Mani for her time today and her thought-provoking discussion on South Asian art, especially the work of Professor Matthew. I'd also like to thank Professor Matthew for participating in the question and answer session. You certainly enriched our understanding of your work. And lastly, I want to thank our amazing support team who helped make this event possible. They're kind of behind the scenes. Leah Cooper, you're doing a great job, and Mary Malicorn. And I also want to thank everyone for attending, and stay tuned for future events, and have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.